Texas, 1881. The late season sun baked the dust into the wooden bones of the market town. Horses neighed, cattle bawled, and men barked over prices, their breath soured with whiskey. The last livestock auction of autumn was winding down, but a crowd still lingered near a corral gate. Inside, a bay mare stood trembling, her ribs sharp beneath her hide, her flanks striped with dried blood. Silas Kerrigan adjusted his hat against the glare, a man shaped by land and silence. At 35, he rarely came to town unless it was for supplies or horses. He had spotted the mare that morning, and now, as the bidding thinned, he circled back, his boot heels thudding against the packed clay. That was when he noticed her. A girl, no more than 19, stood just beyond the corral. Her hair was matted to her face, her dress torn at the hem, and her bare feet were chalked with dust. She did not speak. She did not cry. Her eyes wandered, unfocused, as if tracking something no one else could see. Beside her stood a man with a bottle in one hand and a rope in the other, a rope tied not to an animal, but to her wrist. "Got a dumb one here," the drunk hollered to no one in particular. "Came out of my first wife, I think. She don't talk, don't hear neither. But she cleans, cooks, don't sass. Cheap." A few men chuckled darkly. Silas turned away. He had come for a horse, not for this. But then he felt it. Not a voice, not a cry, but a glance. The girl was watching him. There was no desperation in her face, no pleading in her posture. Just a look, clear, still, and fixed on him. And in that look was something he hadn't seen in a long time. Understanding. Or maybe it was a mirror of his own aloneness. The drunk stumbled closer. You got coin. Want the horse? She comes with it. I ain't dragging her back. Not worth the dust on her toes." Silas hesitated. The mare pawed the ground, blowing froth. The girl's gaze did not waver. He turned back and met the drunk's eyes. "I'll take both." The laughter from the nearby men was instant and crude. "You buying livestock or starting a harem, Silas?" one called out. Silas didn't answer. He counted coins into the man's palm. The drunk yanked the rope, but the girl flinched, instinctively stepping behind Silas. "She's yours now," the drunk slurred. "Don't say I didn't warn you. Ain't worth feeding." Silas untied the rope and tossed it back. He led the mare from the pen, the girl following with soft, deliberate steps. When they reached his wagon, she stopped, waiting. He opened the back and motioned for her to climb in. She did, folding herself into a corner like someone used to being invisible. As he climbed onto the driver's bench, he felt the faintest tug on his coat. He looked down. Her fingers, small and calloused, had brushed his sleeve just once. She wasn't looking at him now. Her gaze rested on the distant hills. But in that single touch, he felt it. She had not thanked him, had not begged. She had simply chosen in that moment to trust him. Silas Kerrigan, who spoke more with horses than with men, who lived alone on 200 acres of red Texas clay with only fences for company. And now, a girl who could not hear, a girl who might understand more than anyone had ever guessed. He snapped the reins. The wagon creaked forward, its wheels crunching over the hardpan road, leaving the town behind. The wagon rolled through dusk and dust until the fields widened and the sky opened into Texas emptiness. Silas's ranch was little more than a house with a slanted roof, a few outbuildings, and a long stretch of prairie. It was quiet, clean, and for a man like him, it had always been enough. He helped the girl down. Her eyes swept the land, not with fear, but with a watchful stillness. as if cataloging everything. Inside, Silas stoked the fire and pointed to the kettle. She nodded and moved toward it without hesitation, finding the tin cups and ladle like someone who had always known the rhythms of fire and hunger. After supper, he handed her a piece of chalk and tapped the wooden doorframe. "Name," he said slowly. She looked at him for a long moment, then crouched. With careful fingers, she scrawled a single word in soft, slanted letters. Emmeline. He read it once, then twice. Emmeline, he repeated aloud, as if testing the taste of it on the air. She offered no smile, but turned and walked out toward the darkened barn. The next morning, Silas found her in the stable beside the beaten-down mare. Emmeline ran a damp cloth down the horse's flank, whispering not with words, but with her hands, a careful rhythm of someone who listened with her palms and her breath. Silas stood at the door, arms crossed. He had seen seasoned ranch hands kicked for less, but the mare stayed still, letting the girl wrap its swollen leg with quiet patience. He gave her chores: wash the floorboards, boil water, clean the tack room. She did them all without a sound. Each night, he left chalk for her, and she would write notes in the margins of their world. Bacon low, dog limping, wind smells like dust. They never spoke, but the quiet no longer felt empty until the storm came. It began with a hot breeze rising at sundown. Silas was in the cattle shed when she appeared, her eyes wild, her breath quick but soundless. She grabbed his sleeve and tugged hard. "What is it?" he asked, startled. She pointed upward, her hands trembling. Her eyes screamed what her mouth could not. "Go." He hesitated, but something in her gaze snapped him into motion. She pulled again, away from the corral, just as the world split in two. A bolt of lightning shattered the sky, striking the great oak behind the shed. The blast shook the earth. The tree burst into flame and collapsed with a groan that sounded like the sky weeping. Silas stumbled back. He looked at her. Emmeline stood frozen, her face lit by the flickering fire, her eyes steady. She had known, not guessed, not sensed it on the wind. She had known before the thunder, before the air itself had changed. He walked toward her, still in shock. "How did you—" She only looked at him. That night, after the fire was doused, he sat beside her at the kitchen table. He realized then, for the first time in years, he wasn't alone. "Emmeline," he said again. She lifted her eyes to meet his. Silence answered, and it was enough. Since the storm, Silas had started to pay attention. One morning, the head cow stood alone in the pasture, not eating. Silas chalked it up to the cold, but Emmeline moved without hesitation. She brought straw to the birthing stall, drew water steeped with mint leaves, and stood beside the cow, stroking its belly in slow, measured circles. By sunset, the cow was in labor. She had known. Another day, he came back from town, the weight of old history heavy on his shoulders. The sheriff had spoken of warnings, of claims on the land. Whispers that his father had taken more than was his during the war. Bloodshed. Guilt. He spoke none of it to Emmeline. But as he sat on the front step, staring into the dusk, she came and stood beside him. She simply placed her hand on his shoulder, light as a breeze, steady as breath. After a long moment, Silas muttered, "How did you know? The shame I feel for this land, for what my father did." Emmeline's dark eyes searched his. Then, slowly, she lifted her hand and placed it on his chest, right over his heart. After a moment, she turned and walked toward the old oak tree where his father's grave rested, silent beneath the sky. She had never read the stone, never asked, and yet she knew. That night, Silas woke from a dream of cannon fire and his father's voice. He saw her then. Emmeline sat in a chair by the hearth, a single candle lit beside her. On the table was a blue handkerchief, faded and trimmed with lace, his mother's. He hadn't seen it in 10 years. It was locked in a cedar chest no one ever touched. He sat up. How? She rose without a sound and walked to the door. She didn't need to explain. He understood. She heard what no one else could. Not words, but the silent weight of grief, the aching sound of a man's heart breaking when he was too proud to let it be heard. And in her quiet, she had answered. For the first time in his life, Silas felt fear. Not for his land, nor his soul. He feared losing the one person who knew what he felt before he ever said a word. The first whisper came from the blacksmith's wife. She stares too long at the cattle, she said, her voice sharp as wire, like she knows which one will fall next. Then it was the preacher's son. She touched our goat, he told a circle of ears. 2 days later, it gave birth too early. That ain't natural. The fewer words Emmeline gave, the more the town filled the silence with their fear. In the general store, a woman pulled her child away as Emmeline passed. She never flinched, but Silas saw the way her fingers curled tighter around her basket, how her footsteps grew quieter, as if trying to disappear from the ground itself. One afternoon, a ranch hand's boy came down with a burning fever. Emmeline went to the barn where he lay. She knelt beside the cot, placed a hand on the boy's chest, then his forehead, and closed her eyes. She returned with a hot cloth and steeped herbs. By sunrise, the boy was sitting up, hungry. His mother wept and held Emmeline's hand in thanks. But the next day, she was whispering at the well. How did she know? How did she know? 3 days later, they came with torches, unlit, but carried like promises. 8 of them stood at the gate of Silas's ranch. The oldest, Mr. Withers, stepped forward. We want her gone, he said. That girl hears things she ought not. Silas stood in the barn's doorway, his face as hard as the timber behind him. She's mute, he said. That ain't the same as deaf, Withers snapped. A steer of mine dropped dead last week. She was the only one who touched it. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Inside the house, Emmeline stood behind the curtain. She had heard the gravel shift under their boots. Silas stepped forward. She saved a child's life. Maybe she gave him the fever in the first place, a woman spat. Silas didn't raise his voice. She is the only person I have ever known who truly listens, he said, his voice low but unshaking. Not with her ears, with her hands, with her breath, with her whole damn soul. I have lived 35 years, and I can count on one hand the number of people who ever heard me. Not my words, but my silences. She did, without saying a single thing. He swept his eyes over them. You want to run someone off for seeing the world you're too afraid to face? Fine, but you'll have to go through me. Slowly, the crowd dispersed, their torches unused. That night, the ranch was silent. Emmeline placed a pot of warm cider on the fire and moved beside Silas at the table. After a moment, she reached out and rested her fingers on his hand. It wasn't thanks. It was recognition. He turned his palm upward and curled his fingers gently around hers. Together, in the stillness, they listened to the crackle of the wood and the bond growing between two souls that never needed words to speak. The first snow of December came quiet and slow, like a blanket laid over all that had burned. By the kitchen window, Emmeline threaded a needle through scraps of fabric, making a cloak not for herself, but for him. She did not need to hear the wind to know the cold was coming. Silas watched her from the barn. The silence of his ranch no longer felt like loneliness. It felt like listening. He had seen the way she gentled the yearlings, using gestures no cowboy had ever tried. She would stand still until a skittish foal inched closer, then raise a single, open hand and wait. And somehow, they always listened. Late one afternoon, Silas rode out to the ridge to check the fences before the storm they both knew was on its way. As the light began to dim, his horse startled and reared. He was thrown hard, landing shoulder first on the frozen earth. The breath rushed from his chest. A throbbing pulse of pain shot through his arm where it had struck a jutting root. He staggered to his feet, blood seeping from his elbow. The sky was deepening fast. Wrapping the wound, he tried to walk, but each step sent a sharp pain through his ribs. By the time he stumbled into the yard, the last light had faded. She was out of the cabin before his knuckles could meet the wood. It was as if she had felt the vibration of his approach through the very earth, one of those strange, uncanny instincts of hers that defied all explanation. She guided him inside, settling him by the crackling hearth, before her gentle fingers began to peel the blood-soaked cloth from his wound. Her brow furrowed in concentration as she worked, a silent language of concern. She brought water to clean the gash, then pressed a poultice of yarrow and pine sap against the torn flesh. All the while he watched her. "You always know," he whispered, the words barely more than a breath. She met his gaze, and in her eyes he saw a world without sound, but full of understanding. Then, without warning, she lifted his hand to her face and pressed her lips, soft and warm, to the ragged edge of his wound. Silas went perfectly still. The fire popped, a lone spark against the sudden, heavy silence that filled the room. Emmeline did not speak. She did not smile. But something passed between them in that moment, quiet and profound, like a door swinging open into a hidden room. Later, as a storm gathered its strength and snow began to dust the window panes, they sat across from each other at the small wooden table. He had taken a piece of paper from a drawer and written on it. The letters formed slowly, carefully, each one heavy with a meaning that could not be spoken. He turned it to face her. "I want to hear your heart," it read, "if you'll let me listen with mine." She looked at the words for a long time. Then her fingers reached out, tracing each letter one by one, as if to feel the truth held within the ink. When she finally lifted her gaze to his, her eyes were wet, but not with sorrow. She reached across the table and touched his chest. A brief single touch that said everything. And then, for the first time since she had stumbled into his life, she smiled. It was not a polite smile, nor one of fear or gratitude. It was a smile like the sunrise, like something breaking free after being held captive for far too long. Outside, the wind howled its mournful song, but inside that cabin, a silence deeper than words had finally found its voice. The days that followed softened. Winter still held the high ridges in its icy grip, but between the storms, life began to stir, and with it, something else, a quiet, steady rhythm between Silas and Emmeline. She began to teach him her language. Her fingers, graceful as branches in a breeze, would shape the words: water, fire, thank you. He was clumsy at first, his own hands fumbling to form the signs, but she never laughed. Instead, she would gently take his hands in hers, guiding them until the shape was right. In return, he taught her to ride. She'd never been in a saddle, and the first time, she clung to the horn with white-knuckled fear. He walked beside the horse, his voice a low, steady murmur she couldn't hear but could surely feel. And she learned, sensing the animal's rhythm through her own bones, moving with it as if they were one. Together, they built a small room off the side of the cabin, a space that was part shelter, part sanctuary. There they shared meals and sat by the fire, wrapped in a comfortable silence that said more than words ever could. He learned her nuances, the way she smiled when birds gathered at dusk, the slight flinch at a sudden pop from the fire, the way she always knew a storm was coming long before the sky turned dark. One night, he spelled out a sentence with his still shaky hands. "You make this place full." She stared at the sign, then reached out and touched her fingers to his lips. It wasn't a kiss, but a silent thank you, a way of saying, "I hear you too." Then came the storm that changed everything. It arrived without warning. Silas had fallen asleep by the fire, exhausted from a long day of mending fences under a calm sky. He woke to her hand on his shoulder, her touch urgent. She thrust his coat at him and pointed toward the barn. Outside, the wind had turned violent. Clouds raced across the moon, and the air crackled with a strange electric energy. Inside the barn, the horses were thrashing in their stalls, their eyes wide with terror. But Emmeline moved among them like a calming breeze, her touch certain and serene. Suddenly, a loud creak echoed from the rafters above. Silas looked up to see a massive support beam splintering. "We need to move them," he shouted over the rising wind. But she was already leading the mare out, her hands signing frantically. "Roof will fall. Now." They worked as one, moving the panicked animals to the new shelter. The rain began to fall, hammering the roof like angry fists. Just as the last horse cleared the doorway, the north beam gave way. With a deafening crash, the entire roof collapsed right where they had been standing seconds before. Silas turned, his heart pounding. Emmeline stood watching the wreckage, her hair soaked, her chest rising and falling with each breath. He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and saw not a fragile woman, but someone as elemental as the storm itself, grounded, unafraid, a part of the wind and the rain. "How did you know, Mo?" he asked, his voice full of awe. She simply touched her own chest, then pointed to the sky. He understood. She hadn't seen it or heard it. She had felt it. Later, back in the warmth of the cabin, he wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and took her hand. He spelled the words slowly against her palm. "You belong to this land." She smiled and placed his hand on her chest, directly over her heart. And for the first time he felt it. Her rhythm, quiet, steady, and real. She did not hear the world as others did. She heard it on a deeper level. And Silas knew, in that moment, that he had finally, truly, been heard, too. The wind that once carried only whispers now seemed to carry footsteps, hesitant at first, then trusting. Something had shifted in the town beyond Silas's fences. not with a roar, but in the quiet way that most real change begins. The first to arrive was Tom Weaver, a ranch hand with a torn shoulder. He showed up one gray morning, holding his reins in one hand, the other arm hanging limp. "Heard she fixes things," he said, nodding toward where Emmeline was kneeling by her herb patch. "Quiet-like." Silas gave a slow nod. "She does." Emmeline came, and without a word, she examined the arm, her hands steady, her brow creased in concentration. She moved as if she were listening not to words, but to the injury itself. A few days later, a widow came, her face etched with sleepless nights. Emmeline simply sat with her at dusk, a gentle hand on her shoulder, until the woman's shaking finally stopped. The next day, the widow returned with a freshly baked pie. "For the girl," she said, "the one who hears more than we do." That winter, the town grew quieter. People started tipping their hats as they passed the ranch. Some left jars of preserves by the gate. And every morning, Emmeline wrote on a small chalkboard beside the kitchen door, "Today will be good. I can feel it." Then came the Sunday that changed everything. A 7-year-old boy had vanished. Panic ripped through the town like a wildfire. Men shouted, dogs barked, and mothers wept. When the news reached them, Silas grabbed his coat, but Emmeline was already moving. She knelt, pressing her palms flat against the cold earth, listening. Then she began to move, not walking, but tracing a path only she could see, a shifted pebble, a broken twig. The townspeople watched, then they followed, through thickets and up ridges until they found him, curled beneath a cedar tree, his ankles swollen, but his eyes wide with relief. After that, no one called her strange. They called her what she was, the girl who hears with her heart. Years passed. The ranch stood, weathered and wiser, wrapped in the steady rhythm of a life unhurried. Silas walked a little slower, and threads of silver had woven their way through Emmeline's long hair. They didn't count time in numbers, but in seasons, in quiet moments, in the silent way a hand finds another in the dark. Children from the town often came to the ranch. Here they learned to listen with more than just their ears. Emmeline taught them how to read the shyness in a rabbit's nose, how to calm a nervous horse with nothing more than a steady breath. She taught them with silence, and with the rare, precious smile she gave when they understood something, without needing it explained. Most evenings, Silas and Emmeline sat on a wooden bench beneath the old cottonwood tree, watching the sun bleed into the hills. He would bring 2 mugs of tea, and she would take his hand, her thumb tracing slow, familiar circles on his skin. One evening, as the shadows grew long, she turned to him. Over the years, she had learned to read lips and shape a few careful words. She still preferred her hands, but this time she used her voice, a sound as soft as a leaf falling on snow. "I do not need sound," she whispered. "Only you." Silas's throat tightened. He simply nodded. "I hear you," he said. "Always have." The next morning she wrote on her chalkboard, "The day will be kind. I feel it." No one asked how she knew anymore. They simply believed her. When the old-timers spoke of her, they no longer whispered the word witch. They called her the one who listens with her heart. The story of Silas and Emmeline was never written down. It didn't need to be, because it was still being lived. A testament to the truth that the deepest love is not the one shouted from rooftops, but the one that walks beside you in the quiet, every single day. If your heart has ever paused for a gaze that understood you without a single word, If you believe that love does not need a voice to be heard, only a soul brave enough to listen, then this story was meant for you. Out on the quiet plains of the American West, where the wind and the silence speak the same language, a lonely rancher and a girl the world called deaf discovered a language deeper than sound, a language of hands, of glances, of hearts that knew how to listen. Thank you for walking this journey with us. If stories of love that endure through prejudice, pain, and unspoken grace speak to you, subscribe to the Wild West Love Stories channel. Here, love is not just told, it's remembered, reclaimed, and it echoes long after the last word fades. We'll see you again in the next story. Until then, may your quiet moments be full, and may someone always hear the heart you carry.